Welcome to this book launch, and today I'll be presenting a book I've written, which is entitled Mother's Final Push, The Story of Humanity's Gestation. It's available in English since this November, so it's a very recent publication. The French version was available a few months back. So the main argument of the book relies on biomimicries, or drawing inspiration from nature. Now, this is common practice in many fields, and you have some concrete examples on the slide. So, for instance, Velcro, the shape of an airplane's wings, or a high-speed bullet train all draw inspiration from nature's design. Now, more specifically, my book is about leveraging our inner wisdom, or the workings of our own bodies. How can we inspire ourselves from the functioning of our own body to help address key societal questions like inclusion, inequality, poverty, resolving conflicts, and so forth? So throughout this presentation, I start off with the premise that each human is like a cell, basically, inside a collective global organism that we call humanity. And then drawing parallels between the human body, our experience in that body growing up, and humanity's own development as a sort of a global collective organism. Now, the picture on the right, in the picture on the right, you have the Leviathan, which is a sort of a fictional entity made up by the British political thinker Thomas Hobbes. So this entity kind of emerged via a so-called social contract that each individual agreed to, deferring to this entity his or her ability to protect oneself using violence. So you're deferring your right to violence to this kind of entity or being. And the idea was that a collective entity would be able to better protect individuals. So this Leviathan was thus a kind of entity which held a power which was the sum of each individual wielding it as a coherent whole. And that sort of idea sort of cemented the nation states ideas with armies, police force, judicial systems, and all the institutions that sprung from that. And it reflects one of the many stages of development of humanity in forming a collective global organism. So we'll play a little guessing game. I'll describe some part of the human body or some experiences that we have had at our human level. And then you can guess what it corresponds to at the level of humanity. And I actually can't see the chat, so you can just like unmute your mic and just answer. That'll be easiest. So let's start with the first one. So imagine if humanity is a global collective organism, what would be the equivalent to our circulatory system at the scale of humanity? Anyone has any ideas?
Roads?
Nope.
Air.
So the circulatory system is in charge of distributing energy to the body.
So electric,
Maybe air.
Yeah, that partly, yeah. Well, actually, it's the financial system, if you think about it. Money is kind of our oxygen at the human level. So you could view money as a form of oxygen because it's vital for humans. In most countries on this planet, you need money in order to access food, shelter, all your basic necessities of life. And then you can convert money into, buying electricity, buying food, buying all kinds of things. So next, if humanity is a global collective organism, what would be its nervous system? Now that one's really easy.
Government.
What would you guess?
Government?
Governments? Not really. Just think about communications. Like the nervous system is about communication. It's sending commands through the body.
Sending commands to humanity.
So imagine humanity is one collective global organism. We're all cells in that body. And what would be our nervous system? The equivalent. Okay, it's the internet, basically. The internet is a series of cables that run around the world that connect every human being, right? So it's kind of like our nervous system. So now hang on tight, because this one is a more difficult one. So if humanity is a global collective organism, what would be the equivalent of the relationship of the placenta to the baby, so some kind of outside organ to the global organism, or the relationship, which is kind of mirrored also by the relationship of the parents to a child? So again, if the baby and the child represent humanity as an organism, what form does the placenta or parents take at the level of humanity? And I've actually heard the answer before, so.
Nature. The nature, I think. But
Nature, that's kind of too macro, something closer to us. Okay, it's actually governments. So think about this. The placenta is a centralized organ which serves as an intermediary between the mother's resources and the baby. The parents are a centralized authority figure which serve as an intermediary between the society's resources and the child. And so a child has to go through his or her parents to access societal resources. He cannot do it on his own. And then humanity, or a society as a collective, has to go through governments, which are, again, a centralized kind of authority or organ, which serve as an intermediary between the planet's resources and society. Whenever you want to exploit the land, build a house, access the planet's resources, you have to apply for permits, respect national laws, hold property titles, enforced by the state or these kind of centralized institutions. Now, this last example will be very important because just as you as an organism has grown in your relationship to your parents, so too humanity or our societies have evolved in their relationship to their governments. And this is what I'll view in the next few slides. So again, let's continue this little game. Put yourself in the shoes of a baby. How does it perceive reality and his parents? And now apply that same pattern to a tribe of humans some 20,000 years ago. How does such a tribe view reality? Anyone?
Blurry.
Blurry, yeah, that's in the beginning, you're kind of blind. But then basically you view reality as something magical, mystical, weird, you don't understand. I mean, a baby looking at his parents, you're basically from a baby's perspective, you're a magician. You can manipulate objects, you can like pick him up, do whatever you want with it. It's just like completely fascinated and doesn't understand much of what's going on. And the same applies to tribes 20,000 years ago, basically, or groups of humans, or humanity as a global maturing organism. They also viewed reality as some kind of thing that is really magical, mystical, with all kinds of different gods, deities, and all that stuff. Spirits of nature, you have the shaman, tribal chief. And then, again, we have an evolution. The organism grows and develops, and now you're in the shoes of a 5-year-old child. So how does that child perceive reality and his parents? And try to mirror that evolution to the evolution of humanity as a society, as a global organism, to, you could say, some kind of external authority, governments or whatever, or reality. Any ideas?
Powerful and something that dominates you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you want to defy it.
I don't know.
Your testing is limited.
Yeah, so basically it's all your monarchies of divine right, kings and queens, and it's also monotheism and anthropomorphized gods, like the bearded man in the sky kind of idea. So 1,000 years ago, you could clearly see that the people as a society could clearly see that the king was not so different from them. I mean, they had a human body. They went to the toilet much in the same way as they did. The king walked also the way they did, but his powers were completely disproportionate compared to that of the people. So a king could snap a finger and you could be killed on the spot by his royal guard. Also, most people had a deep admiration for their king, much like a 5-year-old admires his parents. And like for a child, it's the same. Like from a child's perspective, he can see that he can walk like his parents. He can also pretty much talk like them, but his rights and powers are totally unequal to that of his parents. And so that like a society as a collective now projects that same kind of, experience towards an outward manifested kind of authority figure. And then this was one of my favorites. You have, of course, like again, you evolve as an organism, then you reach the stage of a teenager. So how does a teenager perceive his parents? And then what kind of institutions will be created by humanity as humanity becomes kind of a teenager globally?
Outdated. No, outdated maybe.
What's that?
Like you perceive them as outdated institutions.
Outdated, yeah. But I mean, like, what kind of institutions are they?
They're still the government, no?
Oh yeah, they're still the government, but they're no longer kings. So what are they at that point?
The parliament.
But not
are representative democracies, basically. So basically, a teenager desacralizes his parents, which is what we've done with, God and all that stuff and kings. So teenagers don't admire their parents anymore. Their parents are no longer gods or kings in their eyes. God is dead, to quote Nietzsche. So let's examine the pattern then. So teenagers, first of all, love to criticize their parents, to list all of their faults. Now, if you look at citizens in most democratic governments, they also love to criticize their elected officials. They jump on any occasion to point to corruption, fraud, manipulation, like the saying, like, oh, they're all the same, these politicians, blah, blah, blah. Then teenagers also engage in a power struggle against their parents' authority to acquire more autonomy, freedom, and rights. So they want to have the right to come home later in the evening, to choose their own clothes. And a human society will do the same. It will hold protests and organize strikes to obtain more rights, societal, social, political, economic, and so on. Human rights, freedom of speech. And then finally, while a teenager loves to criticize his parents, he really doesn't want to take that much responsibility. So that's really typical as well. So when governments throw up their hands and say, well, sorry, we're out of ideas, we need your help, we cannot solve these, and you have problem like governments that fail or whatever, in most cases, citizens will say, hey, I've got my own personal problems to take care with. I have to, tend to my own garden and do my own stuff. I'm paying taxes. It's your job to fix these problems, not mine. So that's classical. And then finally, there always comes a time when a teenager grows into a young adult and leaves the parental nest. And how does that translate at our level of reality? Any ideas?
Manifesting protest.
No, protests would still be the teenager's stage.
Living abroad.
Living abroad. I mean, don't forget, this is humanity as a collective global organism that is sort of taking its independence from the parents, which are symbolized as take the form of governments, centralized governments, that is. Okay, I won't torture you too much. It's blockchain technology and all the premises and the seeds of self-governance, decentralized decision making. Like blockchain basically is just like it's like the sign that the teenager is starting to think about living on his own. But it's because it's about reclaiming your financial freedom, basically, from this kind of centralized fiat money. It's about making decentralized decision-making processes, finding tools to do that. And some of you may laugh at this point and say, point to all the scandals and frauds and problems in the crypto space, latest of which the FTX scandal, that the entire crypto industry is just a giant Ponzi scheme and that it'll all go to zero. But how many of you have had children that turned into young adults and moved in with other young adults in a shared apartment or dorm? Any of you have, children that are that age? Yeah, right. So in most cases, what you'll find is total chaos, right? You'll have overflowing garbage cans, unwashed dishes, leftovers of rotten food, mismanagement of money where they spend like there's no tomorrow on payday and then eat frozen lasagnas for the rest of the month. Sometimes going as far as like setting their apartment on fire due to gross negligence, And at the same time, these experiences are formative because at some point they will enable these young adults to grow into fully fledged autonomous individuals that no longer rely on their parents. And you see that exact same pattern repeats with the crypto space, where you can clearly see the overflowing garbage cans and burning apartments. And yet you also see the premises of revolutionary systems hinting at the potential for self-governance and this independence from centralized authorities or bodies of governance like our governments. And obviously these transitions from baby humanity to child humanity to teenager humanity to humanity as a young adult in terms of the global collective organism that we represent, that can happen in many ways. It can happen in a smooth way, like in Britain, where there was a gradual transition from monarchy to parliamentary democracy, or in violent ways like the French Revolution, where you have it's almost like a teenager when he's like 14 thinking he's going to change the whole world, run away from his parents, does crazy stuff, and then comes back home and says, "Ooh, I'm sorry, I messed up." That's kind of the history of the French Revolution, because after the revolution, they came back to royalty and monarchy for half a century or so. And finally, I'll end with a very important experience, which is universal to all humans and which concerns us all at this time, the cutting of our own umbilical cord after birth. Now, what does that experience translate into if you look at humanity as a global collective organism? That should be easy by now. Not a guess? All right, I'll help you. It's the energy transition, basically, from fossil fuels to green or sustainable or renewable energies. You call them what you want. But if you really think about it, the moment where you cut the umbilical cord is the moment where a baby transitions from an unsustainable and non-renewable energy source to a sustainable and renewable one. So towards the end of pregnancy, a baby grows to such an extent that it can draw more resources than his mother can renew. And many women can experience deficiencies in proteins, minerals, vitamins, all that stuff. And switching from feeding off of our mother's blood, which symbolically can take the form of oil if you want, in our case, which is the kind of like the blood of this planet, if you think about it, to breathing with our own lungs is the most radical energy transition that we've all been through. The air we breathe right now is an infinite source of clean energy from the point of view of our organisms, our bodies. So let's now focus on one specific source of inner wisdom and how we can transpose it to our level of reality, the way our body distributes energy to its various parts. Here I'll leverage two different quotes by two radically different political and economic thinkers. So the first quote reads, "From each according to his ability to each according to his needs." Now, who wrote that? That's an easy one. No? That was Karl Marx. It basically encapsulates his idea of communism. So if you think about it, this very accurately describes how your own bodies work. I mean, each cell receives what it needs depending on its ability. I mean, your skin cells play the role of skin cells and they receive the energy they need to do what they're supposed to do. And then also what you, the body, is doing, if you're digesting, resting, running. Now a quote from another very famous thinker. So the rich are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. Now, maybe that's more familiar to you. Do you know who wrote that?
Smith.
Yes, Adam Smith. And again, so this quote is a bit more complex and lengthy, but it also describes how your own body works. So if you think about it in your bodies, who's the big boss that decides how much energy your various body parts should receive? Rather, it seems that there is a kind of magical intelligence that distributes energy exactly as necessary through the body, as if guided by an invisible hand. Now, the issue with Karl Marx was that communism was applied by a centralized authority who saw fit to determine what the ability of people should be, so how many engineers or doctors should be trained, and also determine who deserves what, so what the needs of the people should be, losing this kinds of spontaneous, decentralized, magical intelligence. And the issue with Adam Smith is that the invisible hand only works in an environment where each cell is considered as part of the whole, and not where people are treated as dispensable cogs in a machine that can go die under a bridge when there's no need for their labor or service anymore. So let's look at our current financial economic system and draw some parallels between the way humanity developed on this planet with the development of a baby still inside the womb. So the way it works now is monetary mass has to grow at the same pace as the total availability of goods and services. There has to be growth in order to service interest on debt. The whole system relies on a rollover of credit into infinity, so new debts are used to repay old debts, and you just repeat that process into infinity. And there's this, it just all manifests as this exponential expansion, which mirrors the growth of a fetus inside the womb. So you can see like the graph of world GDP or US money supply or human population. You can see that it all just basically goes exponential, especially from the moment we have adopted a debt-based monetary system with interest and all these kind of things. Now, let's be a little bit more specific and look at how money works and answer the key question of what is money. Now, you've all heard the textbook boring definition of money, which says that money is a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. Now, to me, that says absolutely nothing about what money is. It's rather describing some of its characteristics, but without actually defining what it is. It's like saying a car has wheels, seats, and a steering wheel, but failing to say that it's a means of transportation. So what is money according to me in this current debt-based monetary system? Money is the formalization of a social debt translated into abstract numeric values issued by a bank, which has the right to enforce the execution of the debt. So let's pick that definition apart. Ultimately, anyone can really create money. If I need help because I'm moving out from my home and my friend comes to help me for 3 hours, there's a kind of informal social debt that has been created between us. I could decide to formalize it and give it a little paper to my friend saying, I owe you 3 hours of my time. Now that piece of paper is ultimately the same as a 50 euro bill with a few minor differences. Firstly, my friend cannot go to the hairdresser and trade that voucher for a haircut, since the hairdresser doesn't know me and therefore doesn't trust that the trade is worth it or that I will honor my promise. Second, the piece of paper isn't linked to a repayment schedule or interest. Third, if I suddenly decide that I don't like my friend anymore and that I won't honor my debt, there is no authority which will force me to make good on my promise. And finally, fourth, the voucher I created is based on time as a currency, as opposed to fiat money, which deals in abstract numeric values. So in essence, commercial banks are institutions that are entitled to emit universally accepted vouchers of social debt. And the state give those banks the right to force people to honor their promises. So they can come and take the property of your car away or your house away and sell it into the market so that they recoup your social promise that you didn't deliver on. So the value of money, its store of value, is therefore linked directly to the seriousness and reliability of the people in honoring their promises, and especially in finding ways to grow the economy to match the level of interest on debt. So if tomorrow people decided that they didn't want to repay their debts anymore, money would become as worthless as the voucher that I gave to my friend. Also, one has to realize that the speed at which the economy runs is heavily influenced by the repayment of debt. People can decide to consume less, defer the purchase of a good, but they can't arbitrarily decide that this month they want to repay a little less on their loan repayments. And that is essentially what artificially gives a stable rhythm to an economy on top of other fixed expenditures like salaries and rent. And then everything else is designed in our economy to match that artificial rhythm via advertising or creating to create steady and recurring income streams for companies. Because obviously companies have these kinds of recurring expenditures, and so that has to be mirrored by the way that we consume. So you can see that from that moment, for the moment, centralized governments, commercial banks, and loans with interest, from the moment all of that came into existence, we've experienced exponential growth. And that pretty much mirrors the development of a baby inside the womb. So long as the baby is inside, his body grows and expands exponentially at a steady pace, and the energy inflow is stable and continuous. But nowadays, many economists are underlining the incompatibility between exponential growth and a world with finite resources. And so the question is, how can we move beyond a debt-based monetary system and at the same time achieve certain key policy objectives like inclusion, equity, justice, social welfare, and so on? So to this end, I'll present to you the relative theory of money by Stéphane Laborde, which is a French economist, which completely redefines what money is and how it functions. The relative theory of money essentially views money as a form of voting mechanism to determine what has value and what doesn't. Whenever you spend money at the baker, for instance, what you're doing in a way is voting for the endured existence for that baker's business. You could say it's almost like a demand pool mechanism. The relative theory of money, or RTM, underlines that every human is inherently equal when it comes to assessing what has value and what doesn't. Every single human has different needs and different priorities, and no single human holds a form of universal wisdom which should allow him or her to determine what the economy should look like. This translates in the RTM as an equal right of each individual to determine what has value and what doesn't equally across time, meaning that each generation has an equal voting weight in determining what has value. So it's their relative control of the monetary mass, every day and through time. It's kind of like trying to recreate the principle of the wisdom of the crowd. I won't explain what that is now, but I mean, if you want, I'll explain it later. The RTM addresses a a key major concern in monetary policy, which is securing price stability and ensuring that money becomes a stable measuring stick. So nowadays, the stability of money as a measuring stick relies on the synchronous fluctuation between the monetary mass on the one hand and the total availability of goods and services on the other. But that's a very delicate balance to keep. And so money as a measuring stick isn't very effective as the stick keeps expanding and shrinking depending on, what, central banks do and all that stuff. Now, to address this problem, the RTM leverages the principle of relativity. In order to measure anything in the universe, one needs to find a measuring stick which is constant, and then all other things can fluctuate around such a constant. Now, in Einstein's principle of relativity, that constant is the speed of light. Don't be scared. I'll go through these as I'm speaking. So, with the RTM, what the relative theory of money is doing is that it simply takes the current monetary mass, it looks at its annual growth, which is around 10% in the Eurozone, and then it divides up that extra addition of fresh money and distributes it symmetrically across all individuals inside an economy on a daily basis. And that includes even babies. So in the Eurozone, that would amount to around 10 euros per person per day. And this amount is then called a universal dividend. Now, in the RTM, there's no more monetary destruction, like when you repay a loan. Basically, when you create a loan, there's a creation of money. When you repay a loan, it's a destruction of money. So money leaves the economy. Here, money constantly circulates in the economy. Money is created ex nihilo and is not a debt. It's this idea of using money as a voting mechanism. Each day, every single citizen has a new opportunity to vote by spending his universal dividend for the goods and services he or she thinks have value. And that's like transforming the entire economy into a giant permanent crowdfunding. Now, in the tables that you have on the left, you have two different tables, basically. One that's measuring things in an absolute terms or in individual units of currency, and the other which counts in universal dividends or in relative terms. So on the left, you have an economy with 3 individuals and zero-sum exchanges. So basically, whatever you pay someone, somebody else pays you back. So, it's almost like they have a stable kind of income. The first individual has 1,000 units of currency. That's like P1, you see on the first column, 1,000. The second has 2,000, and the third has 3,000. The total monetary mass is 6,000 units of currency. On the first year, each person receives 200 units of freshly created universal dividend money. And you can see that year over year, the universal dividend increases by 10%, and the amount of currency in the economy grows exponentially. Now, in such a scenario, most economists would see inflation reaching insane levels since money circulates forever in the economy and never leaves. Now, on the right, you have the exact same economy with 3 individuals, zero-sum exchanges, except now you're counting using universal dividends as your point of reference. So if everyone receives the same universal dividend, you can also count or assess the value of things using a universal dividend as a measuring stick. So in essence, instead of saying that a computer costs 1,000 units of currency, you could also say it costs 5 universal dividends, since 1 universal dividend on year 1 equals 200 units of currency. Now, if you look at that table, the first individual starts off with 5 UD, or universal dividends, the second with 10, and the third with 15. The monetary mass is 30 UD, and each year the amount of individual units of currency is increased by 10%. But since you're using the UD as a frame of reference, your monetary mass stays the same, because you constantly divide the monetary mass by the new value of the universal dividend. However, the relative share of the total monetary mass controlled by each individual changes. So the effect that the RTM has over time is that every single individual is pulled towards a mean or an equalization of the total amount of wealth one has compared to another. So it's a form of a melting currency, but with a very interesting property. It naturally equalizes wealth without the need for taxation as a redistribution mechanism. Now we can view such an effect visually in the following graph, where over time, the relative share of the total monetary mass that individuals control goes towards the mean. Here you have 5 individuals in an economy, and you can see that as time goes by, everybody's sort of pooled towards all having 10 as an amount that they have in terms of the money or the universal dividends that they hold. Now, what's really interesting is when you compare such a system to the way that our own bodies distribute energy. On the left-hand side, you have a graph which maps oxygen consumption to the body during exercise and rest. And on the right-hand side, you have a graph where you still have the same 5 individuals as in the previous graph, but now you introduce economic exchanges where one person spends money and somebody else receives it. You can see a very similar phenomenon at play. So whenever you pay someone, it's as if that person temporarily has a higher level of oxygen or money consumption. And then if there's no more exchanges happening, the level of money or oxygen one has normalizes back towards the mean. And it works in exactly the same way in our bodies. If you run, energy flows naturally to your legs. When you sit down to listen to a Zoom conference, energy rushes to your brain. Right now, as you're listening to me and you're breathing in and breathing out, every single one of your cells is receiving a kind of universal dividend or a share of the total monetary mass creation or oxygen that you draw out of thin air. And then it is distributed inside the body depending on the needs. In the RTM, it is the individual decisions of millions of people in an economy daily that determines where money will concentrate and thus how the economy will grow. And while in a debt-based monetary system, money is destroyed to match the destruction of goods and services via the repayment of a loan, in the RTM, money is rather periodically debased in the same way as your legs who receive less and less oxygen if you stop running and their level of consumption of oxygen normalizes. In our current monetary system, essentially, it's as if you were still under census suffrage, or a kind of democracy where certain people, like the rich or the aristocrats under census suffrage, had all the votes. In a debt-based monetary system, 3 actors have a disproportionate influence on what the economy looks like. Commercial banks, via their decision to lend or not to someone, which determines at the outset what goods and services will be available in the economy to purchase, and which people will be able to pick from. Then you have governments, obviously, that distort also all this, what's available in an economy. And then finally, you have the ultra rich, which also influence what goods and services are available more than other people. If you view humanity as a global collective organism, then whenever money concentrates, it allows to transform reality in a certain way or move the collective body of humanity in a certain direction. So a few centuries ago, when the church held most of the money, it moved society or the cells of humanity as a global collective organism to build cathedrals. Nowadays, when a billionaire like Elon Musk controls a lot of money, it allows him to put humanity into motion to send a sports car into space, for instance. So in practice, the relative theory of money has been used to create a cryptocurrency called the June or G1. And Duniter, you can find more information on duniter.org. And there are many effects linked to a monetary system based on the RTM, but amongst the most important that I want to list here is that you can go beyond growth. So growth is no longer required. The economy can basically fluctuate, expand, and contract more naturally. You have an equal vote. The economy will reflect more accurately the sum total of each individual decisions to buy a certain good or service. And then you have symmetry in access to money. So many monetary problems are due to an asymmetry of money creation. Who gets to the freshly created money first? As is the case in inflation, for instance, where people that get to the money first are advantaged compared to those who get to the money later. Now, I'm sure you've all seen this graph, which represents what most post-growth economists are calling for, a kind of S-curve where the GDP plateaus, moving away from the exponential growth logic. Except that this is very difficult to achieve under a debt-based monetary system. Now, let's go back to nature's wisdom. These 2 graphs represent, in the lower left, the growth of a baby inside the womb, and in the upper right, the growth of a baby once outside the womb. So can you see the pattern? Do you see the S-curve? So every single human has gone through this universal experience of, as a growing exponentially as a global collective organism while inside its mother's womb, and then the growth rate sort of slows down radically after birth. So when I'm saying birthing a new economic and financial system, I mean it quite literally, in fact. So, as I've already pointed out in the very beginning of my presentation, we have never really left biomimicry. This is also the thesis at the center of my book. So as humans, we've just recreated in our outer reality a wisdom that was contained within each and every human from the start. We've recreated our nervous system, which takes the form of the internet. We have recreated our circulatory system, which takes the form of the financial system. Looking at commercial banks, governments, and big multinational energy companies, all of these entities basically represent a kind of placenta or an organ which serves as the intermediary between this planet's resources and individual humans. But while these institutions have a role to play in order to grow humanity as a global collective organism to a point where all of our organs or countries are mature and developed enough to function as a collective in a harmonious way, at a certain point, the role of the placenta comes to an end, and then the lungs and stomach take over. So, just a few days ago, I saw a news article which says that we've made huge advances in nuclear fusion. It doesn't really matter what form or what kind of energy system or technology replaces oil. It's the logic that's really most important here. It's this trend, this pattern of separating from these centralized institutions and having access to more freely available and quote unquote infinite energy. So what we need is a resilient financial system which can weather shocks and sudden changes, much like what happens to a baby after birth, where it's no longer in a stable and controlled environment. And for that, the RTM is the perfect choice since it doesn't rely on centralized institutions to control and pilot everything, but it distributes money to each individual equally to create a form of wisdom of the crowd effect, birthing a collective decentralized intelligence, much like that of our own bodies. And obviously, there are many more things to talk about, like how to handle and transition from one system to another, or imagine hybrid systems where debt is still used for financing mega projects or long-term investments like a mortgage. But I won't have the time to cover all these considerations here. Now, in my book, I go much further and discuss plenty of these other links between our inner experience and our bodies and our outer experience, such as the internet, artificial intelligence, energy, politics, and I also look at key challenges and issues such as climate change, the coronavirus, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and how viewing humanity as a collective global organism can help address these challenges. So you'll find my book on Amazon. It's available as paperback and ebook for Kindle. You can also visit my website, YoumanE.T.life, where I provide my services as a speaker on these various topics I address in my book. So thanks a lot for your attention. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And that'll be all from me.